I remember the light in our kitchen every morning for 23 years. It was a soft, golden hue that seemed to promise that as long as the coffee was brewing and the house was quiet, nothing could ever truly go wrong. My name is Elena, and for most of my life, I believed that love was a house built of bricks and routine. I married Arthur when I was 22, a time when my heart was full of unwritten chapters, and he was the only author I ever wanted. He was ambitious, yes, but he always came home. He always kissed my forehead before leaving for the firm, and he always noticed when I changed the curtains or baked his favorite lemon tart. We were the couple that people pointed to at dinner parties, the ones who had survived the lean years, the sleepless nights of raising two children, and the inevitable cooling of passion that comes with time. Or so I thought. Our life was a collection of beautiful, mundane moments. I spent my days ensuring that the world Arthur returned to was seamless. I managed the accounts, the social calendar, the children's educations, and the unspoken emotions that floated through our hallways. Arthur was a rising star in the corporate world, a man whose word was law in the boardroom. But at home, he was the man who forgot where his keys were and needed me to remind him that he liked his steak medium rare. I took pride in that. I took pride in being the foundation upon which his success was built. I never saw it as a sacrifice. I saw it as a partnership. We were a team, or at least, that was the script I had memorized. I remember the 25th anniversary party we threw. It was lavish, perhaps too much so, but Arthur insisted. He wanted the world to see what we had accomplished. I wore a dress the color of midnight, and as we danced, he whispered in my ear that I was as beautiful as the day he met me. I felt a surge of warmth, a profound sense of security. Looking back, I wonder if he was already practicing his lies then. I wonder if the hand on my waist felt heavy with the weight of his secrets. But at that moment, in that golden light, I was the happiest woman alive. I believed in the forever we had promised each other in a small chapel decades ago. I believed in the sanctity of our home. The children, Sarah and Leo, were our greatest achievements. Sarah had Arthur's sharp intellect and my stubborn heart, while Leo was the dreamer, always looking at the stars. We were a complete unit. Our Sundays were sacred long lunches that stretched into the evening, filled with laughter and the kind of comfortable silence that only comes from decades of knowing someone's every thought. Arthur would sit at the head of the table, the patriarch, looking at us with what I perceived as absolute devotion. I lived for those Sundays. They were the anchors that kept me grounded when the world felt too fast. I spent years cultivating our garden, literally and figuratively. I knew every rosebush, every weed, and every shadow that fell across our lawn. I thought I knew the shadows in Arthur's heart, too. I thought I knew his fears, his regrets, and his dreams. But there is a specific kind of blindness that comes with deep, long-term love. You stop looking at the person in front of you and start looking at the image of them you've carried for years. I didn't see the man Arthur was becoming. I only saw the boy I had married. I didn't see the subtle shift in his gaze or the way he started staying at the office just a little longer each night. I saw a hard-working husband providing for his family. I saw a man who deserved my unwavering support. The secretary, Clara, was a name I heard often before I ever met her. Clara handled the filing. Clara scheduled the merger. Clara reminds me to take my vitamins. I felt a sense of gratitude toward her. I thought she was making his life easier, which in turn made our life easier. I even sent her a gift basket one Christmas, a gesture of appreciation from one woman to another. I imagine now how they must have laughed at that. The irony of the wife thanking the mistress for her service. The pain of that realization is a slow, cold burn that never quite goes away. It settles in the marrow of your bones and waits for the silence of the night to remind you of how foolish you were. But in those early years, those perfect years, there was no Clara in my mind, only Arthur and me. We traveled to Tuscany, we walked through the streets of Paris, and we sat on our porch watching the sunset. We discussed our retirement, the house by the lake we would buy, the grandchildren we would spoil. We were building a future on a foundation of sand, but to me, it felt like granite. Every kiss, every I love you, every shared glance across a crowded room was a lie I told myself, or a lie he told me so convincingly that it became my truth. I was a queen in a kingdom of glass, unaware that the first stone had already been cast. Our home was my sanctuary, a place where the smells of lavender and expensive would intertwine to create an illusion of permanence. I spent hours selecting the right textures for the sofa, the right paintings for the walls, believing that if the environment was beautiful, the life within it would be too. Arthur always encouraged this. "Make it ours, Eleanor," he would say, handing me his credit card with a smile that reached his eyes or so I believed. I was the curator of our happiness, the architect of a peace that was, in reality, a fragile truce between his ambition and his infidelity. I remember the sound of his car pulling into the driveway at exactly 6:30 p.m. It was the rhythm of my life. That sound meant I could breathe again, that the day was a success because he was home. I would wait by the door, not out of duty, but out of a genuine, aching need to be near him. I was a woman who had given everything, my career, my youth, my identity to the altar of our marriage, and I did it with a smile. I didn't realize that while I was building a monument to our love, he was already searching for the exit. The change didn't happen like a lightning strike. It was more like a slow, persistent leak in a basement that you choose to ignore until the foundation starts to rot. It began with the phone. For 20 years, Arthur's phone was just a tool, an object he would leave carelessly on the kitchen counter or the nightstand. But then, almost imperceptibly, it became an extension of his body. He began to carry it face down. He would take it with him to the bathroom, to the garden, even when he went to take out the trash. When I asked him about it, laughing, he would just say the firm was in the middle of a delicate merger, and he couldn't afford to miss a single alert. I believed him because believing was easier than the alternative. I chose to see his anxiety as professional dedication rather than personal betrayal. But the silence between us started to change. It was no longer the comfortable, warm silence of two people who knew everything about each other. It was a cold, hollow silence filled with the things he wasn't saying. I remember the first time he forgot our Friday night ritual. For a decade, we had gone to the same small Italian bistro downtown. It was our time to reconnect away from the children and the house. One Friday, I was dressed and waiting, the scent of my perfume filling the hallway. But 7 p.m. came and went. Then 8 p.m. When he finally walked through the door at nearly midnight, his tie was loosened and his eyes were bloodshot. He didn't apologize with a kiss or flowers. He just sighed, muttered something about a crisis with a client, and went straight to the shower. I sat on the edge of our bed, listening to the water run, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I told myself I was being needy, that a man in his position carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. I convinced myself that my role was to be the peace he returned to, not another problem he had to solve. So, I stayed quiet. I swallowed my disappointment until it felt like a permanent lump in my throat. Then there were the business trips. They became more frequent and always seemed to fall on weekends or birthdays. I remember my 47th birthday. I had planned a quiet dinner, just the two of us. 2 days before, he told me he had to fly to Chicago. It's Clara's fault, he joked half-heartedly. She booked this meeting months ago, and I can't back out now. That was the first time her name felt like a thorn in my side. Not because I suspected her yet, but because she seemed to have more control over his time than I did. I spent my birthday alone, eating leftovers and watching the rain against the window while he was supposedly in a boardroom. I called his hotel room that night, but there was no answer. When he called back 3 hours later, the background was too quiet and his voice was too controlled. I was in the hotel bar with the team, he said. I wanted to ask him why I couldn't hear the clinking of glasses or the murmur of voices, but the words died in my mouth. I was afraid of the answer. Our physical intimacy began to feel like a performance. On the rare occasions he touched me, it felt hurried, as if he were checking a task off a list. He stopped looking into my eyes. He would kiss my cheek instead of my lips, and he always seemed to be in a rush to turn off the light and sleep. I would lie there in the dark, inches away from him, feeling like he was miles across an ocean. I started to notice the smell of him was different. It wasn't perfume, he was too smart for that, but it was the absence of us. He didn't smell like our home anymore. He smelled like expensive hotels and cold air. I began to obsess over small details. A new shirt I hadn't bought for him. A credit card statement with a charge from a boutique I didn't recognize. When I confronted him about the charge, he snapped. Eleanor, I don't have time to explain every penny I spend on clients. Do you want this lifestyle or not? It was the first time he had ever used our wealth as a weapon against me. It silenced me instantly. The children noticed too, though they didn't say it directly. Sarah stopped asking him for advice on her career, sensing his preoccupation. Leo became more withdrawn, spending more time at his friends' houses. The vibrant, laughing home I had built was becoming a museum of who we used to be. We were still going through the motions. The Sunday lunches still happened, but the laughter was forced, and the conversations were shallow. We talked about the weather, the kids' grades, the stock market. We talked about everything except the giant, growing void between us. I was mourning a marriage that was still technically alive, grieving for a man who was sitting right in front of me. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, watching the walls I had decorated crumble in slow motion. I was waiting for him to come back to me, not realizing that he had already left, and I was just the last person to know. I decided that the problem was me. It is a dangerous thing, the way a woman can turn her own heart into a sacrificial altar to save a ghost of a marriage. I convinced myself that if I were softer, thinner, more attentive, or perhaps more invisible, Arthur would find his way back to the center of our lives. I began a period of intense, almost frantic, self-improvement. I started waking up an hour earlier to ensure my hair and makeup were perfect before he even opened his eyes. I wanted the first thing he saw to be a reminder of the woman he had chosen decades ago. I spent afternoons in the kitchen, sweating over complex French recipes he had once mentioned in passing, hoping the scent of garlic and butter would anchor him to our table. I was trying to buy his love with my labor, unaware that you cannot reclaim a heart that has already been gifted to someone else. My faith became my refuge, but it was a desperate, bargaining kind of faith. I started going to the small stone church at the edge of town, not just on Sundays, but on Tuesday afternoons when the pews were empty and the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and beeswax. I would kneel until my knees ached, whispering prayers that felt more like negotiations with God. Just give us another year, I would plead. Make him remember who we are. I will be better. I will complain less. I will be the perfect wife if you just make the shadows in his eyes disappear. I thought that if I suffered enough, if I sacrificed enough of my own dignity, I could earn a miracle. I was treating my marriage like a debt that could be paid off with my own unhappiness. I believed that my endurance was a virtue, when in reality it was just a slow-motion suicide of the soul. I remember one specific evening. The air was heavy with the threat of a storm. Arthur came home later than usual, his face a mask of exhaustion that I now recognize as guilt. I had prepared a candlelit dinner, the silver polished, until it shined like mirrors. I had put on the silk robe he used to love. When he walked in, he didn't even look at the table. He didn't look at me. He just walked to the sideboard, poured himself a double scotch, and stared out the window. "I'm not hungry, Elena," he said, his voice as cold as the ice in his glass. I felt something snap inside me, but instead of screaming, I just smiled. I walked over to him and started rubbing his shoulders. I felt the tension in him, the way he stiffened at my touch as if I were a stranger. I kept rubbing, my hands shaking, telling him about the kids, about the garden, about a future that felt like a fantasy. I was talking for both of us, filling the silence so I wouldn't have to hear the truth. Denial is a thick veil. It allows you to see the evidence and call it something else. When I found the long, blonde hair on his wool coat hair that was definitely not mine, I told myself it must have come from a crowded elevator or a seat on a plane. When I found the receipt for a diamond necklace that never touched my neck, I convinced myself he was hiding a surprise for our next anniversary, even though it was 6 months away. I tucked these pieces of evidence into a dark corner of my mind, locking them away. I became a master of the everything is fine smile. My friends would ask how Arthur was, and I would recite a scripted list of his professional achievements, my voice bright and brittle. I was protecting his reputation, but more than that, I was protecting the illusion of my own life. If the world believed we were happy, then maybe, just maybe, I could believe it too. I started apologizing for things that weren't my fault. I apologized for the weather, for the news, for the fact that the kids were growing up and moving away. I became a shadow in my own home, moving quietly so as not to disturb the fragile peace. I thought that if I made myself small enough, Arthur wouldn't feel the pressure he kept complaining about. "You're always hovering, Eleanor," he snapped one night when I simply asked how his day was. So I stopped hovering. I stopped asking. I became a ghost, waiting for a sign of life from a man who was already dead to our relationship. I was sacrificing my pride, my intuition, and my sanity on the altar of a forever that had already expired. I told myself this was what love looked like: hindrance, silence, and a faith that defied all logic. I was a martyr for a cause that had already been lost. The truth didn't arrive with a dramatic confession or a tearful late-night confrontation. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, carried by the mundane clinical efficiency of a misplaced digital ghost. Arthur had left his iPad on the kitchen island, something he never did, and it was buzzing incessantly. I usually respected his privacy with a religious devotion, but the name on the screen caught my eye: Clara. Beneath it, the preview of the message was a jagged blade that sliced through 23 years of my life in a single second. "The apartment is ready. I can't wait for us to finally start our real life. I love you, Arthur." My heart didn't race. It felt like it stopped beating entirely. The air in the kitchen, once filled with the scent of lavender and home, suddenly felt thin and toxic. I picked up the device, my fingers trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. I didn't need a passcode. The screen was already open to a gallery of photos that Arthur had evidently been curating for months. There they were. Photos of them in places I recognized and places I didn't. They were in a sun-drenched balcony in a city I hadn't visited, smiling with an intimacy that felt like a physical blow to my stomach. Arthur looked younger in those photos, happier, lighter, more present than he had been with me in years. He was looking at her the way he used to look at me when we were in our 20s, and the world was ours for the taking. Clara was beautiful, yes, but it was the look of possession in her eyes that sickened me. She wasn't just his secretary, she was the architect of my replacement. As I scrolled, I found emails meticulously organized folders. One was titled Transition. It contained leases for a luxury penthouse in the city, signed by Arthur. It contained bank transfers of significant sums of money, our money, to an account I didn't recognize. But the most devastating find was a draft of a letter addressed to me, dated 3 weeks prior. In that draft, Arthur didn't sound like the man I loved. He sounded like a stranger, performing a cold, corporate amputation. Elena, I've realized that we've been living a lie for a long time. I need to find my own happiness. I've made arrangements for you to stay in the house for now. The words blurred as tears finally came, but they weren't the tears of a grieving widow. They were the tears of a woman who had been erased while she was still standing in the room. He hadn't just cheated, he had planned his exit like a business merger. He had calculated the cost of our marriage and decided that I was a liability to be liquidated. I realized then that every late night at the office, every business trip, and every stressful merger was a brick he was laying in the wall of his new life with Clara. I heard the garage door open. The familiar hum of his car, which usually brought me comfort, now sounded like the approach of an executioner. I didn't move. I stood there by the kitchen island, the iPad glowing in my hands like a piece of radioactive debris. When Arthur walked in, he was whistling. He dropped his keys, and for a split second, he looked like the man I had married. Then he saw me. He saw the device in my hand. The color drained from his face, replaced not by shame, but by a chilling, clinical annoyance. He didn't rush to apologize. He didn't fall to his knees. He simply closed the door behind him and leaned against it, crossing his arms. I suppose it was only a matter of time before you went snooping, Elena, he said. His voice was devoid of warmth, devoid of history. It was the voice he used for employees he was about to fire. In that moment, the shock turned into a cold, hard clarity. The man standing before me wasn't my husband. My husband had died a long time ago, or perhaps he had never existed at all. The betrayal wasn't just the affair. It was the realization that he had watched me struggle, watched me pray, watched me sacrifice my dignity to save us. All while he was picking out furniture for a new apartment with another woman. He had allowed me to play the role of the devoted wife, while he was already rehearsing his lines for a new play. The shock was a physical weight, a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe, but beneath it, a new feeling was beginning to stir. It wasn't anger yet. It was something deeper. Something that would eventually lead me to the will, and to the truth about what Arthur had truly planned for his departure. I didn't scream. I thought I would, but my voice came out as a cold, hollow whisper that seemed to startle him more than a shout would have. "How long, Arthur?" I asked, holding the iPad up like a mirror to his soul. He didn't flinch. He walked past me toward the liquor cabinet and poured himself a drink as if we were discussing the monthly mortgage. "If you're looking for a timeline, Elena, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I've been unhappy for years, and I've finally found someone who doesn't make me feel like I'm suffocating under the weight of your expectations." The cruelty of his words was like a physical slap. Suffocating? I had spent 2 decades making sure he had air to breathe, taking every burden from his shoulders so he could fly. I really looked at him and saw the stranger he had become. The man I loved would have been devastated to see me this way. This man was just inconvenienced. You call our life an expectation? I felt the heat rising in my chest, a fire that had been suppressed by years of perfect wife behavior. I built this home. I raised your children. I stood by you when you had nothing, and now you talk about suffocating because you found a younger woman who looks at you like you're a god. She doesn't love you, Arthur. She loves the life I helped you build. She loves the man I made you into. He laughed then, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed through the kitchen. You didn't make me anything, Elena. You were just there. You were a part of the scenery. But the scenery is outdated now. I've already filed the papers. I've already moved the money. You can have the house, it's too big and too quiet anyway. I want a life that actually feels alive. The confrontation moved to the living room, a space I had meticulously decorated with memories that now felt like insults. I stood my ground as he began to pack a small leather bag with his essentials. He was so efficient, so detached. What about Sarah and Leo? I asked, my voice trembling for the first time. How are you going to explain to them that their father is a coward who traded his family for his secretary? He stopped, his hand gripping the edge of his suitcase. For a second, I saw a flicker of the old Arthur, a shadow of guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. The children are adults. They'll understand that people change. And don't call her that. Clara is more of a partner to me than you've been in a decade. She understands my world. You just understand the curtains and the menu for Sunday lunch. Every word he spoke was a systematic demolition of my identity. He wanted to leave me with nothing, not even the dignity of my memories. He told me he had been planning this for over a year. He told me he was tired of my neediness, my constant prayers, and my refusal to see the truth. He blamed me for his betrayal. It was the ultimate gaslighting, the criminal blaming the victim for the crime. I'm leaving tonight, he said, zipping the bag with a finality that sounded like a gunshot. The lawyers will contact you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Elena. You've always been so good at being the graceful one. Stay that way. He walked toward the door, not even pausing to look back at the room where we had celebrated so many milestones. But as he reached for the handle, I felt a strange shift in my spirit. The sadness was still there, a massive, crushing weight, but a new, colder resolve was hardening around it. I remembered the will. I remembered the documents, my father a man much wealthier, and more cautious than Arthur ever knew had left in my name, things Arthur thought were shared, but were actually mine. I remember that, while he was busy playing house with Clara, he had neglected to check the fine print of our joint holdings and the trusts my family had established. He thought he was the one in control, the one disposing of an old asset. He didn't realize that he was walking out of my life with far less than he imagined. Arthur, I called out, my voice steady now, almost calm. He paused, his hand on the knob. You're right. I have always been graceful. And you should remember that grace can be a very quiet way of saying goodbye to someone who no longer deserves a seat at the table. He let out a dismissive grunt and walked out, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind him. The house was finally quiet, but for the first time in 20 years, the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like war. The silence that followed the slamming of the door was not the peaceful quiet I had spent a lifetime cultivating. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. I stood in the center of the living room for what felt like hours, watching the dust motes dance in the moonlight that filtered through the curtains Arthur had so cruelly mocked. I felt like a trespasser in my own life. Every object I looked at, the crystal vase we bought in Venice, the hand-woven rug, the family portraits on the mantel now felt tainted by the shadow of his betrayal. I walked through the house, room by room, feeling the phantom presence of a man who had already erased me from his future. The bed we had shared for 23 years looked like an altar to a dead religion. I couldn't bring myself to lie down. I couldn't bring myself to cry anymore. The tears had been replaced by a cold, crystalline numbness that sharpened my senses. I went to his study, a room I usually entered only to bring him tea or to file away his bank statements. The scent of his expensive cologne and old paper still lingered there, but it no longer felt like the scent of success. It smelled like decay. I sat in his leather chair, the one he said made him feel like a king, and I looked at the desk where he had spent months plotting his transition. My hands were steady as I began to open the drawers he had always kept locked. He had been so arrogant, so sure of my grace and my blindness, that he hadn't even bothered to take the physical copies of the documents he thought he had successfully hidden in the digital cloud. I found a blue folder tucked behind a stack of old journals. It wasn't about the merger. It was a detailed plan of how he intended to liquidate our shared assets before the divorce was even finalized. As I read through the documents, the magnitude of his cruelty became clear. Arthur hadn't just been unfaithful, he had been predatory. He had used the power of attorney I had granted him years ago to move funds from my inheritance money my father had intended for me and the children into shell companies linked to Clara's family. He had planned to leave me with this house. Yes, but a house burdened by a secret second mortgage I knew nothing about. He wanted to leave me gracefully destitute, a faded relic of his past, while he started fresh with my father's wealth. A dark, cold laughter bubbled up in my throat. He had forgotten one crucial detail. My father hadn't just left me money, he had left me his lawyer man, who had seen men like Arthur rise and fall for 40 years. I picked up the phone. It was 2:00 a.m., but I knew Marcus would answer. When he did, his voice was gravelly but alert. "Eleanor? Is everything all right?" I looked at the documents spread across the desk, the evidence of Arthur's theft and his cowardice. "No, Marcus. Everything is finally clear. Arthur left tonight. He thinks he's taken everything. He thinks he's left me with nothing but the curtains." I paused, my eyes fixing on a specific clause in my father's trust that Arthur had clearly overlooked, a clause that triggered an immediate freeze on all connected assets in the event of documented financial infidelity or embezzlement. "I need you to start the process. I want the injunctions ready by morning." He wanted a new life. Let's see how he likes it when he realizes he's bankrupt. The rest of the night was spent in a blur of cold, mechanical action. I didn't think about the love we had shared. I didn't think about the way he used to hold my hand. I thought about the numbers. I thought about the law. I thought about the children. I called Sarah and Leo. They were devastated, of course, their voices breaking as I told them the bare facts of their father's departure. But I didn't let them fall apart. Listen to me, I told them, my voice sounding like steel. He chose this. He chose to walk away from us. But he doesn't get to take our future with him. I am going to fight him, and I need you to stand with me. In that moment, the graceful Elena died, and a woman I didn't yet recognize took her place. I watched the sun rise over the garden I had spent years tending, and for the first time, I didn't see beauty. I saw a battlefield. The final meeting didn't take place in our home, but in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of Marcus's law firm. Arthur arrived with Clara on his arm, a move clearly intended to humiliate me. He looked smug, wearing a new suit, and that same clinical mask of indifference. He thought he was there to sign the final papers of my surrender. He thought he was about to walk out with the keys to a new kingdom funded by my family's history. Clara sat beside him, whispering in his ear, her eyes filled with a hollow triumph. I sat across from them, dressed in a simple, charcoal suit. I didn't look like a victim. I didn't even look angry. I looked like a woman who had finally finished a very long, very tedious book. Marcus began by laying out the evidence I had found in the study. As he spoke, the smug look on Arthur's face began to crack. Marcus detailed the unauthorized transfers, the shell companies, and the breach of the trust's moral and legal clauses. Arthur, Marcus said, his voice echoing with the authority of decades of law. You were so focused on the exit that you forgot who built the door. Every cent you moved from the inheritance has been frozen. Moreover, because of the embezzlement clauses Elena's father integrated into the trust, your personal assets, including your shares in the firm, are now being seized to restitute the marital estate. The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur turned to look at Clara, but she wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the documents, her face pale, as she realized the wealthy man she had stolen was suddenly a man with nothing but the clothes on his back. You can't do this, Arthur stammered, his voice thin and desperate. That money was part of our life. I leaned forward then, looking him directly in the eyes for the first time since that night in the kitchen. Our life ended the moment you decided to treat me like an obsolete asset, Arthur. You told me I was just part of the scenery. Well, the scenery has a cost. I pushed a single document across the table. It wasn't a divorce settlement. It was a copy of my father's final will and the specific instructions he had left me regarding unworthy successors. My father had known. He had seen the small signs of Arthur's greed decades ago, and had built a fortress around me that only a betrayal of this magnitude could activate. Arthur had literally triggered his own destruction. Clara left him that afternoon. She didn't even wait for the meeting to end. She excused herself to take a call and never came back. I watched Arthur realize it in real time, the realization that the real life he was so eager to start was built on the same sand he had accused me of living on. He was left alone in that room, a king without a crown, a husband without a home, and a man without a future. He tried to speak to me as I stood up to leave, reaching for my hand, but I stepped back. There was no hate in me, only a profound, quiet exhaustion. I didn't want him to suffer. I simply didn't care if he did. He had become a stranger again, and this time I had no desire to know him. I walked out into the afternoon sun, the air feeling fresh and clear for the first time in years. I went back to my house now, free of the secret mortgage and the ghost of his presence. I spent the evening in the garden, not because I wanted to hide, but because I wanted to see the roses bloom. I realized that my life wasn't over. The perfect beginning I had cherished was just the prologue. The real story was beginning now. I am Elena, and I am no longer a wife, a martyr, or a victim. I am a woman who survived the wreckage of a 23-year lie and found the truth waiting for her in the ruins. As the sun set, casting long, peaceful shadows over the lawn, I sat on the porch and finally, for the first time in a very long time, I took a breath that was entirely my own.